Let's talk about Hazel Cedar Troost's Reclaiming Touch, Rape Culture, Explicit Verbal Consent, and Body Sovereignty. So, in this text, Troost is arguing that we need to start thinking about the role of consent in everyday non sexual interactions as well as in our sexual interactions. Particularly, Troost is really focused on the idea of bodily sovereignty, about the ability of each individual to set boundaries, to decide for themselves what happens to and with their own bodies. Troost argues that we need to respect other people's bodily and sexual agency, and we need to start recognizing that people ought to be able to decide what happens with their own bodies. Troost here is thinking about the role of touch in everyday life. Now, once you start really looking around, you might notice, oh, wow, the idea of what Troost calls assumptive touch is really everywhere. So, assumptive touch is the idea that it's okay based on either something about a pre existing relationship with a person, oh, or maybe about the context of your interactions, or something about, oh, some social facts of the individual. Now, based on these things, it's okay to touch certain people in certain ways without having to ask for consent. Crucially, assumptive touch assumes that the closer the relationship, the more you just get to touch other people without requiring that consent. I want to be very clear here. Troost is not in support of this. This is not a way of moving through the world that Troost is encouraging. But let's start by trying to make sure that we understand what this idea of assumptive touch is, so that we can understand why it is that Troost is arguing against it. So let's start off with some examples. Let's see. The first, and honestly, I think the most striking example is the ways that we treat children. We treat children as being, and I mean this quite literally, up for grabs. We treat it as if it's okay to just pick up a child, right? If you are their parent or if you are friends with their parents, even if the child clearly does not want to be picked up, we treat it as if it's, just an okay thing to do, to put your hands on another human being's body, lift them up and move them around. Now, it might be one thing if it was a small child who was in danger, but that is not the only way that we treat children's bodies as being, and I mean this quite literally, up for grabs. We tell small children, go give your aunt a hug, right? We don't let children decide who is going to be hugging them. And remember, little kids are little, adults are so much bigger than that, right? And yet, we just allow adults to, again, start touching children's bodies. We don't treat it as if children have the right to decide what happens to or with their bodies. So we tell children what to do with their bodies. But even more than that, we don't let children make these sorts of decisions for themselves. So it's really a striking example of assumptive touch at play in daily life in our social world. Let's see some other examples. Pregnancy. Folks who experience pregnancy often have this experience of having strangers come up to them and touch their pregnant stomach. As if that's somehow okay or normal to have a stranger come up and just start touching your body. And then the stranger might start asking questions like, oh, when is the baby due? Which is an invasive question in and of itself, but is particularly intense when their hand is on your body. So we treat certain bodies as being more permissible to touch than others. Folks of color, especially Black folks, often have the experience of particularly white people coming up and touching their hair as if it were, quite literally, up for grabs. Now, it is noteworthy that cis-het white men rarely have the experience of strangers coming up and touching them in this way, right? So we tend to assume that some people have bodily sovereignty, but folks who are marked out as other, and particularly folks who are marginalized or lack other forms of social power, are viewed as having decreased rights to bodily sovereignty. right? It's not viewed as necessary to ask permission or consent before touching some people's bodies. Let's see who else. Folks who use wheelchairs often report the experience of strangers just coming up and starting to push their chair, which for those who don't use wheelchairs, once you start pushing a chair, the person in the chair, it's very hard for them to control where they're going or to control what is happening, right? So strangers sometimes think that this is somehow helpful. But again, it's moving another human's body without their consent, without them having asked for it. It is a bodily violation, right? It is not even recognizing that some folks get to have control over their own bodies. Assumptive touch also has to do with what sorts of relationship a person has with someone. Under assumptive touch, there tends to be this assumption that if you've got the right kind of relationship, that somehow makes it okay to just start touching people in certain ways. And the more intimate or the closer the relationship, the less consent is required for that touch. So, under assumptive touch, if you go up to a group of people you are friends with, you're genuinely friends with them, under assumptive touch, it's considered just totally okay to just put your arms around them, right? You don't have to ask or check in beforehand. If you've got a good relationship with your boss, they might assume that it's okay to just rest their hand on your shoulder while they're saying that you did a good job on something. Okay. Under assumptive touch, if folks are in a sexual and romantic relationship with one another, there tends to be this assumption that it is just okay to, maybe come up behind someone and wrap your arms around them in a great bear hug. Again, without checking in first. So this is where Troost talks about what are often called consent maps. It's this idea that on the basis of having this sort of relationship, there are certain kinds of body parts that one gets to touch on the basis of that relationship. Now, notice the way that this is flipping things around. It's saying, because of this relationship, one is granted rights to another person's body so that consent no longer matters. We might instead think that it should go the other way, that when you are in a relationship with someone, you might demonstrate the intimacy of that relationship sometimes by granting them consent. Shouldn't be the case that consent no longer is needed. So under assumptive touch, it's viewed as an indictment of the relationship if you resist this kind of touch. If your significant other comes up and again does that great big bear hug, and you say, I prefer that you not do that, their response might be something along the lines of, oh, I'm sorry, I just thought we had that kind of relationship. I thought we were close. I'm sorry, I guess we have some problems. Or if you are expressing that kind of boundary to a friend, maybe, and you're like, I just prefer to know who is touching me before you start touching me. They might say, oh, my bad. I guess I thought we were chill, right? So expressing these boundaries, asking, again, that people ask for consent or check in before touch is viewed as, a way of saying, no, we don't have such an intimate relationship that you just get to touch me without consent, right? It's viewed as a commentary on the quality of the relationship rather than just as a mere request for consent, or a way of saying, I just prefer when you touch me like that, or I just prefer that physical sensation, or I just prefer that right now, right? So these sorts of limitations aren't recognized as an expression of bodily sovereignty, but are instead viewed as a very dramatic kind of refutation of the relationship itself. Okay, so assumptive touch seems like it's not really a great model for thinking about touch, nor is it a particularly great model for thinking about bodily sovereignty or sexual and bodily agency. So Troost argues that we should start adopting this practice of explicit verbal consent before touching other people. Now, with explicit verbal consent, this model of consent requires spoken consent for each new instance of touch. It is something significantly more robust than the mere semantic model of consent, but it also is a good bit narrower than the affirmative model of consent. Notice that it needs it to be spoken and that it also requires spelling out what kind of touch it will be. Is it okay if we shake hands right now? Is it okay if we have a hug or if we hug in this moment? Right, so it requires explicitly articulating what kind of touch it will be before that touch takes place. So yet another model of consent. So Troost argues that we should start practicing explicit verbal consent in our daily lives, not only for sexual touch or for sexual interactions, but for all moments of touch. Folks are often resistant to this idea because it seems like it will be intrusive or cumbersome to sort of pause and ask for consent before engaging in this kind of touch. It's very different from what a lot of the daily practices under assumptive touch look like. However, Troost writes about the ways in which they've experienced a much greater degree of not only bodily sovereignty, not only bodily agency, but also comfort and joy in the moments of touch that they do have because that touch is chosen and consensual, right? Think about the difference between a random moment of touch and you're like, well, that was weird. I wish that didn't happen. Or maybe even that's just that you were ambivalent about, like, okay, that was okay, whatever. Versus something that you've actually chosen or something that you actually know the other person has chosen. That's so much more affirming and fulfilling. Or if someone says, oh, yeah, I actually don't really like hugs, thinking about ways that you can actually be demonstrating care and respect and intimacy with that person in a way where they will actually feel cared for and respected. And they will actually feel like they have an intimate relationship because they are being respected. Right? So actually listening and communicating with one another about what kind of touch and what kind of interaction is not only permissible, but also welcomed or desired changes the quality of those interactions in ways that Troost argues makes for far more flourishing interactions more broadly.